The paratrooper stands in the door of the C-47 at 0300 hours on August 15, 1944. First Lieutenant Dan DeLeo, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Can see nothing below but darkness. Somewhere down there is southern France, the drop zone near Le Mouilly, and German forces who may or may not be waiting. In 2 hours, the largest airborne operation in the Mediterranean theater will drop 5,000 paratroopers behind German lines. In 4 hours, the first wave of landing craft will hit beaches between Toulon and Cannes, carrying 94,000 French and American troops. And in the weeks that follow this invasion, the second Allied amphibious assault on occupied France will drive 300 miles north to link up with forces from Normandy, capture 2 major ports, trap an entire German army, and fundamentally alter the strategic situation in France. Yet 70 years later, most people have never heard of Operation Dragoon, the forgotten invasion that Churchill opposed, Eisenhower demanded, and Stalin requested, an operation that succeeded beyond expectations while being overshadowed by the more famous landings 10 weeks earlier on the beaches of Normandy. Southern France mattered because of logistics. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, put Allied forces ashore in northwestern France with a supply line running back to England across the Channel. But Allied armies advancing from Normandy faced a critical constraint: port capacity. The artificial Mulberry harbors could handle limited tonnage. Cherbourg, captured in late June, was partially destroyed and required months to restore full capacity. As Allied forces advanced deeper into France, the supply lines lengthened while capacity remained fixed. By late July, planners were projecting that advancing armies would outrun their logistics by September. The solution was additional ports on the Mediterranean coast. Toulon and Marseille together could handle capacity equivalent to Cherbourg, dramatically expanding Allied supply capabilities. But these ports were in German hands, defended by Army Group G, and beyond reach of forces advancing from Normandy. The only way to secure them was amphibious assault. Planning for a southern France invasion had begun in 1943 under the codename Operation Anvil. The concept: land forces on the Riviera coast, drive inland, capture Toulon and Marseille, then advance north up the Rhône Valley to threaten German forces from the south while Normandy forces attacked from the west. The operation would be conducted by the 7th United States Army under Lieutenant General Alexander Patch and French forces under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. Churchill hated the plan. He wanted Mediterranean resources directed to Italy, pushing through the Po Valley into Austria and the Balkans, cutting off German forces in southeastern Europe. The Italian campaign was grinding forward successfully, if slowly. Diverting forces to southern France would weaken the Italian offensive for what Churchill considered a secondary objective. His objections were strategic but also political. A thrust through the Balkans would position Western Allied forces to liberate southeastern Europe before Soviet forces arrived, potentially limiting Soviet post-war influence. Eisenhower and the American Joint Chiefs wanted southern France. The amphibious assault would directly support operations in northern France, opening critical ports and threatening German forces from a new direction. The Balkans were peripheral to the decisive theater. Every resource should support the drive into Germany through France. Stalin agreed, not from military logic, but because a southern France invasion prevented Western forces from reaching the Balkans before the Red Army. The Americans prevailed. Operation Anvil, renamed Dragoon in late July allegedly, because Churchill felt he had been dragooned into accepting it, received final approval for execution in mid-August. The invasion force assembled in Naples, Taranto, and other Italian ports, 9 divisions, over 250,000 troops, though only 94,000 would participate in the initial assault. The naval component under Vice Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt comprised over 850 vessels, including 5 battleships, 9 escort carriers, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. Air support came from Operation Dragoon Air under Major General Ralph Royce. Over 3,000 aircraft from bases in Corsica, Sardinia, and Italy. The invasion beaches stretched 25 miles along the Riviera coast between Toulon and Cannes. 3 sectors: Alpha, Delta, and Camel. Alpha Beach, west of Saint-Tropez, assigned to the 3rd United States Infantry Division. Delta Beach, between Saint-Tropez and Saint Raphael, assigned to the 45th United States Infantry Division. Camel Beach, near Saint Raphael, Assigned to the 36th United States Infantry Division, behind the beaches, 1st Airborne Task Force. 5,000 paratroopers and glider troops tasked with seizing key terrain and blocking German reinforcements. German defenses were formidable on paper. Army Group G under General Johannes Blaskowitz controlled 11 divisions, approximately 280,000 troops. But these numbers were misleading. Most units were understrength, poorly equipped, and consisted of overage soldiers, recovered wounded, or conscripts from occupied territories whose reliability was questionable. The best formations had been transferred to Normandy after D-Day. What remained were static infantry divisions tied to coastal defense and a handful of mobile divisions held in reserve. The 19th Army under General Friedrich Wiese held the Mediterranean coast. 5 infantry divisions occupied the invasion sector: the 242nd, 243rd, 244th, 338th, and 716th. None were at full strength. Equipment was dated. Rifles from the First World War, captured French weapons, obsolete anti-tank guns. The Luftwaffe presence was negligible. Fewer than 200 aircraft, mostly trainers and reconnaissance planes. The Kriegsmarine had essentially no presence. The Mediterranean was an Allied lake. But the terrain favored defense. The coast between Toulon and Cannes alternated between rocky cliffs and narrow beaches backed by mountains. Roads were few and easily blocked. The inland routes passed through steep valleys where small forces could delay larger ones. If German forces defended competently and received reinforcements, they could make the invasion costly and slow. Allied intelligence identified the weak points through extensive reconnaissance. Ultra-intercepts revealed German dispositions and unit strengths. Air reconnaissance photographed every mile of coastline. French resistance provided ground-level intelligence about defensive positions, minefields, and garrison routines. The intelligence picture was more complete than for any previous Allied amphibious operation. The deception plan, Operation Ferdinand, aimed to convince Germans the invasion would hit Genoa, Italy, not southern France. Dummy radio traffic suggested troop concentrations in Italian ports. Fake landing craft were positioned where German reconnaissance could photograph them. Resistance networks in Italy fed false information to German intelligence. The deception partially succeeded. German forces in northwestern Italy remained in position when they might have been transferred to southern France. The airborne assault began at 0300 hours on August 15th. 440 C-47 transports dropped paratroopers from the 509th, 517, and 550th Parachute Infantry regiments over drop zones near Le Mouet, 15 miles inland from the beaches. The drops were scattered, typical for night operations. Some units landed miles from their objectives. Others landed directly on German positions and took casualties before assembling. But the dispersion actually aided the mission. German forces received reports of paratroopers landing across a 20-mile area and could not determine the main effort. They dispersed their reserves, chasing small groups, leaving key objectives weakly defended. By 0600 hours, American paratroopers had secured the town of Le Mouet and blocked the main road from the north. At 0800 hours, the naval bombardment began. 5 battleships, USS Arkansas, USS Nevada, USS Texas, HMS Ramillies, and French battleship Lorraine, opened fire on coastal defenses. The battleships carried guns ranging from 12-inch to 15-inch, shells weighing between 800 and 1,900 pounds each. Cruisers added their 6-inch and 8-inch guns. Destroyers closed to within 2,000 yards of shore, firing on specific pillboxes and gun positions. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Over 13,000 shells struck German positions. Bunkers collapsed. Artillery batteries were destroyed. Communications were severed. The German defenders, already demoralized by Allied air superiority and aware of the Normandy disaster, faced a firepower demonstration that made resistance seem futile. At 0800 hours, the first wave of landing craft crossed the line of departure and headed for shore. The sea was calm, almost flat, perfect conditions for amphibious operations. Overhead, fighters and fighter bombers from the escort carriers provided top cover, strafing any defensive position that showed signs of activity. Heavy bombers had struck inland targets throughout the night, destroying bridges, blocking roads, and isolating the invasion area from potential German reinforcements. The 3rd Division hit Alpha Beach at 0800 hours. Resistance was minimal. German defenders, stunned by the bombardment, surrendered in groups or fled inland. By 0900 hours, the division had secured all beach exits and was advancing inland. Casualties: 34 wounded. No killed in the initial assault. The 45th Division landing at Delta Beach encountered slightly heavier resistance. German machine guns fired from fortified positions until destroyer gunfire silenced them. Engineers cleared obstacles and mines while infantry pressed inland. By 1000 hours, the beachhead was secure. The division began moving toward Saint-Tropez. The 36th Division at Camel Beach faced the heaviest opposition. German forces had fortified the coastal towns and occupied buildings overlooking the beaches. Artillery fire from positions in the hills caused casualties among landing craft, but American firepower was overwhelming. Naval guns destroyed every German position that revealed itself by firing. By midday, Camel Beach was secure and troops were pushing into St. Raphael. By 1800 hours on August 15th, all three divisions were ashore with over 94,000 troops, 12,000 vehicles, and 46,000 tons of supplies landed. Allied casualties: 95 killed, 385 wounded. German casualties: over 2,000 killed or wounded, 4,800 captured. The contrast with Normandy was stark. Omaha Beach alone had cost over 2,000 American casualties on D-Day. The Dragoon beaches were secured with losses that barely registered statistically. The reasons for the low casualties were multiple. The naval and air bombardment had been more intense and accurate than at Normandy. German defenses were weaker, the units manning them less capable. The beaches themselves, though smaller than Normandy's, were less heavily fortified. And German commanders, recognizing the strategic situation was hopeless, were less willing to sacrifice troops for positions that could not be held. General Wyss faced an impossible decision. His coastal divisions were shattered. His mobile reserves, the 11th Panzer Division and the 198th Infantry Division, were positioned too far north to intervene immediately. Allied air power made daylight movement suicidal. If he committed reserves to counterattack the beachhead, they would be destroyed by naval gunfire and airstrikes before reaching effective range. If he withdrew to preserve his forces, he would surrender the coast without serious resistance. Wyss chose preservation. On the evening of August 15th, he ordered a general withdrawal northward. Coastal units would delay as long as possible, then break contact and retreat. Mobile divisions would screen the withdrawal. Trading space for time, the objective was to reach the Rhone Valley and establish a new defensive line while evacuating forces west of the Rhone before they were cut off. This decision sealed the fate of German forces in southwestern France. The 19th Army could only retreat through a few routes: up the Rhone Valley, through the mountain passes, along the coastal roads. All were vulnerable to Allied interdiction. The French resistance, now openly active, blocked roads, sabotaged bridges, and ambushed retreating columns. Allied aircraft hunted German convoys mercilessly. The French forces landing in follow-up waves had a specific mission: capture Toulon and Marseille. General Delattre commanded the French First Army, reorganized from forces that had fought in North Africa and Italy. The 1st Armored Division, 1st Infantry Division, 3rd Algerian Infantry Division, and 9th Colonial Infantry Division, approximately 100,000 men, well equipped with American vehicles and weapons, but officered and motivated by desire to liberate French territory. Delattre launched the 1st Armored Division directly at Toulon on August 20th. The approach was textbook mobile warfare: armored columns bypassing resistance, infantry following to mop up, artillery supporting from moving positions, German forces defending Toulon. Elements of the 242nd Infantry Division and naval personnel numbered approximately 18,000 troops. They occupied fortifications built to defend against naval attack, positions that were nearly useless against land assault from the north. The battle for Toulon lasted a week. French forces surrounded the port, cut it off from reinforcement, and systematically reduced defensive positions. German resistance varied. Some units fought hard, particularly naval personnel who viewed surrender as abandoning their post. Others surrendered quickly once their positions became untenable. By August 28th, Toulon was secure. French casualties: approximately 2,700 killed and wounded. German casualties: over 10,000 captured, several thousand killed or wounded. Marseille fell 4 days earlier. The 3rd Algerian Division attacked the city from the east, while the 9th Colonial Division approached from the north. The garrison, approximately 13,000 troops, was isolated and had no prospect of relief. Fighting was concentrated in the port area where German forces attempted to demolish facilities before surrender. French troops prevented the worst destruction, capturing the port largely intact. Marseille fell on August 28th. The capture of both ports weeks ahead of schedule was a strategic triumph. Allied planners had estimated Toulon would require 45 days to capture, Marseille 30 days. The French First Army accomplished both in 2 weeks. More importantly, both ports were in better condition than expected. Demolitions were incomplete. Dock facilities were repairable. By early September, both ports were handling cargo, dramatically easing the logistics crisis facing Allied armies in France. Meanwhile, the 7th Army drove north up the Rhone Valley. Resistance was sporadic. German units retreating from southwestern France tried to escape encirclement, but were harassed constantly by French resistance and Allied air attacks. The French forces of the interior, resistance fighters now operating openly, liberated towns and cities ahead of advancing Allied forces. In many areas, American and French troops arrived to find tricolor flags already flying and German prisoners already rounded up. The pursuit became a race. Could Allied forces cut off the retreating 19th Army before it reached defensive positions further north? Eisenhower committed additional resources, including the 6th Army Group under Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, to coordinate operations in southern France. Armored columns drove forward at speeds exceeding 30 miles per day, far faster than doctrine suggested sustainable. The decisive engagement came at Montélimar, a town on the Rhone River 200 miles north of the invasion beaches. The 36th Infantry Division, advancing rapidly, reached Montélimar on August 21st and blocked the main north-south highway. Behind them, the retreating 19th Army was strung out along 100 miles of road, a target-rich environment for artillery and air attack. For 4 days, August 21st through August 24th, German forces attempted to break through the Montélimar roadblock. They attacked with elements of the 11th Panzer Division, supported by what remained of several infantry divisions. American forces held their positions, called in artillery and airstrikes on German columns, and inflicted devastating casualties. The highway became a graveyard of destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and dead soldiers. Some German units escaped by abandoning their heavy equipment and moving through mountains east of the Rhone. Others surrendered. The 19th Army, which had numbered over 110,000 troops when the invasion began, was shattered. By September 1st, it had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Survivors straggled north, disorganized and demoralized, having lost most of their equipment and cohesion. The link-up between Dragoon forces and Normandy forces occurred on September 11th near Dijon. The 7th Army advancing from the south met elements of Patton's 3rd Army advancing from the west. The two invasion forces, launched 10 weeks apart from different directions, had connected, creating a continuous Allied front across France. The strategic impact was immediate. German forces in France were divided into isolated pockets. The garrisons holding French Atlantic ports were cut off and besieged. The 19th Army was destroyed. Most importantly, the logistics situation that had threatened to stall Allied advances was resolved. Toulon and Marseille provided the port capacity to supply armies driving into Germany. By November, these two ports were handling more tonnage than all the Normandy ports combined. The cost of Operation Dragoon was remarkably light relative to results achieved. Allied casualties from August 15th through September 15th, 4,000 killed, 17,000 wounded. German casualties, 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded, 130,000 captured. 2 major ports captured intact, 300 miles of French territory liberated, an entire German army destroyed. Yet Dragoon remains the forgotten invasion. Normandy dominates public memory and historiography. The dramatic circumstances of D-Day, the iconic images of Omaha Beach, the proximity to Britain all contribute to Normandy's prominence. Dragoon, by contrast, was distant, less costly, and came after the decisive moment. That it succeeded brilliantly made it less dramatic, less worthy of attention in a narrative culture that privileges struggle over success. Churchill's opposition also affected Dragoon's historical legacy. His post-war memoirs portrayed the invasion as strategic error, resources wasted that should have supported the Italian campaign or an alternative strategy. Subsequent British historians often echoed this view. American historians defended Dragoon as vindication of sound logistics-based planning, but their arguments remained academic rather than entering popular consciousness. The soldiers who fought Dragoon knew its importance. They had executed a near-perfect amphibious operation, advanced 300 miles in a month, destroyed a German army, and captured critical objectives ahead of schedule, but they received little recognition. No films were made about Dragoon. No iconic photographs emerged. The operation succeeded too easily to generate dramatic narratives. The French forces particularly deserved recognition they rarely received. The First Army's capture of Toulon and Marseille demonstrated that French military capability had not been destroyed by the 1940 defeat. French troops fought skillfully and aggressively, liberating French territory with minimal Allied assistance. Delatre's leadership proved that French generals could execute modern mobile warfare as effectively as their American counterparts. The paratroops who jumped at 0300 hours on August 15th established the conditions for success. Despite scattered drops, they secured objectives, blocked German movement, and created confusion that prevented effective German response. First Lieutenant Dan DeLeo survived the jump, the landing, and the campaign. He participated in the subsequent advance through France and Germany. Ending the war as a captain, he returned to civilian life, having participated in an operation most people never heard of. A perfect execution of amphibious warfare that succeeded so completely it generated no legends. The German perspective on Dragoon was resignation. After Normandy, German commanders recognized France could not be held. The question was how long they could delay Allied advance while inflicting maximum casualties. Dragoon answered that question decisively: not long, and at greater cost to defenders than attackers. The operation demonstrated that when Allies achieved proper force concentration, air superiority, and logistics superiority, German forces could not effectively resist regardless of defensive positions or tactical skill. The terrain that should have favored defense became irrelevant when defenders lacked mobility, air cover, and sufficient strength. The narrow coastal roads, the mountain passes, the river crossings, all the natural obstacles that might have channeled and delayed attackers, meant nothing when Allied air power could destroy anything that moved in daylight, and French resistance controlled the countryside. Operation Dragoon proved the maturity of Allied amphibious warfare capabilities. Every lesson from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had been incorporated. Intelligence was comprehensive. Planning was thorough. The naval bombardment was precisely targeted. Landing craft operations were smooth. Beach management was efficient. The transition from landing to inland advance happened with minimal friction. The operation demonstrated institutional learning, the ability to improve procedures and avoid repeating mistakes. It also demonstrated strategic flexibility. When Churchill proposed canceling Dragoon to support Italy, Eisenhower refused. But his refusal was based on analysis, not stubbornness. The Italy option had been examined and found wanting. The Po Valley offensive would consume resources without producing decisive results. The Balkans were peripheral. Dragoon directly supported the main effort in northern France, and that support proved invaluable when Toulon and Marseille began handling cargo in September. The forgotten invasion that succeeded too well. The second D-Day that overshadowed itself through competent execution. Operation Dragoon stands as example of military operation perfectly planned and executed, achieving objectives ahead of schedule and below projected casualties, then being forgotten because success generates no legends. The soldiers who fought it deserved better. The operation deserved recognition as one of the war's most successful amphibious assaults. Instead, it remains footnote to Normandy, eclipsed by the more famous landings that struggled where Dragoon succeeded. At 0300 hours on August 15th, 1944, First Lieutenant Dan DeLeo stood in the door of his C-47 and jumped into darkness. Below him was southern France and the beginning of an operation that would validate every lesson Allied forces had learned about amphibious warfare. The operation succeeded brilliantly, captured its objectives, destroyed a German army, and then faded from memory because success without struggle makes poor narrative. But success changes history regardless of whether history remembers.